Emily Carter was just 25 when she walked away from her quiet life in Texas and her husband Daniel, chasing the glittering promises of a Dubai Sheikh, only for half her body to be found floating in the Persian Gulf 1 month later. On a warm June evening in a quiet Texas suburb, 25-year-old Emily Carter seemed to vanish without a trace. The neighborhood was the kind where everyone waved from their driveways, where lawns were trimmed neatly, and where strangers stood out immediately. Emily and her husband, Daniel, had lived in a modest single-story home at the end of Willow Creek Lane, a place most residents thought of as safe and uneventful. Their life appeared ordinary. Daniel worked long shifts at a local auto shop, and Emily often stayed home, occasionally visiting friends or helping out at the small-town library. To the outside world, they were just another young couple trying to build a future together. But on that night, the routine broke apart. Daniel later told police that when he went to bed, Emily was already asleep beside him. By morning, her side of the bed was empty, and so was her closet. Several of her clothes were gone, along with her passport and phone. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, and no calls for help. It was as though she had simply walked out into the darkness and never returned. At first, neighbors thought it might have been a domestic argument, a young wife seeking a break. But as hours turned into days, worry spread. Flyers with her photo began appearing on light poles, and search teams combed through wooded areas nearby. Rumors started to circulate. Some whispered about secret struggles in her marriage. Others suggested she might have run off with someone else. Daniel stood at the center of it all, exhausted, confused, and under suspicion. The image of a happy couple was shattered, and a mystery had begun to grow in the most unsuspecting corner of Texas. When investigators dug deeper into Emily's disappearance, they quickly discovered that her life was not as simple as it appeared. Late at night, while Daniel was asleep or working overtime, Emily had been spending hours online. Her browsing history revealed a secret world hidden behind the quiet exterior of a suburban wife. She had been part of exclusive chat groups, private forums, and social media circles where wealthy men flaunted their fortunes. It was within this digital maze that Emily began to dream of a life far beyond Texas. Among the many names she interacted with, one stood out: a Dubai-based sheik whose reputation for wealth and extravagance stretched across continents. His lifestyle was a constant display of gold cars, private jets, and palaces that looked like they belonged in fairy tales. To Emily, trapped in a routine she found suffocating, the glamour was intoxicating. Messages exchanged between them showed how quickly she became drawn in. He promised her a new beginning, luxury beyond imagination, and a chance to escape the ordinary life she no longer wanted. Emily's computer history revealed careful planning. She had searched for flights leaving Dallas, looked up visa requirements, and studied travel tips for women in the Middle East. On hidden social accounts, she followed influencers who boasted of lavish lives abroad. The more she saw, the more restless she became. What she kept from her husband and friends was that she was no longer just curious, she was determined. By the time authorities pieced together her online activities, Emily had already taken steps toward leaving. Every late-night conversation, every secret save file, was part of a path she was building toward someone who existed in a world completely different from her own. It was a secret life that no one in her hometown ever suspected. When news of Emily's sudden disappearance spread, all eyes turned to the person closest to her, her husband, Daniel. In nearly every missing persons case, the spouse is the first suspect, and this one was no different. Detectives arrived at the modest home on Willow Creek Lane, questioning every detail of Daniel's story. He explained that Emily had been in bed when he last saw her, and by the time he woke up, she was gone. To investigators, it sounded too simple, too convenient. They began to wonder if Daniel had something to hide. The search of the house revealed no signs of struggle. Furniture was in its place, no broken glass, no stains or unusual marks. Yet, the fact that Emily's passport and phone were missing raised suspicions. Why would a young woman leave in the middle of the night without telling anyone? For detectives, one explanation remained clear: Daniel might have staged her disappearance. In the days that followed, police scrutinized his every move. They checked his bank records for large withdrawals, traced his phone activity, and even examined security cameras from nearby streets. Surprisingly, the evidence began to clear him. On the night Emily vanished, Daniel's car never left the driveway. Neighbors recalled seeing him at home, and his phone data showed no suspicious gaps. Despite his nervous demeanor during questioning, nothing tied him directly to Emily's vanishing. Still, public opinion weighed heavily against him. Some locals whispered that he must have driven her away. Others believed he was hiding a dark temper. Daniel looked broken, sleepless, unshaven, and confused by the chaos unfolding around him. Whether innocent or guilty, his life had been ripped apart overnight. As investigators pushed forward, one thing was certain. If Daniel wasn't responsible, then someone far away had been pulling Emily into another world. The turning point in the investigation came when officials traced Emily's passport records. Just 2 days after Daniel reported her missing, her name appeared on a flight manifest leaving Dallas for Dubai. The discovery shocked both her family and the investigators. Emily had not been abducted from her home, nor had she disappeared into the woods near town. She had boarded a plane willingly, carrying the documents and belongings she had secretly packed in advance. Surveillance footage from the airport provided more clues. Cameras captured Emily moving through the terminal alone, wearing dark sunglasses and a scarf pulled tightly around her face. She avoided eye contact, her steps quick but deliberate, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. There were no signs of hesitation. She appeared to have rehearsed the escape, blending into the crowd until she was gone. Investigators dug into her digital trail and found that her ticket had been purchased through a foreign travel agency linked to Dubai. The payment was not from her own account, but from an unidentified source, confirming that someone else had arranged her journey. That detail turned suspicion away from Daniel and toward the mysterious figure Emily had been communicating with online. When her plane touched down, she entered a world far removed from the small Texas suburb she had left behind. The luxurious lifestyle she had long admired on social media was suddenly within reach, and she stepped into it willingly. But investigators were quick to note that once she arrived, her freedom began to shrink. Her movements could no longer be tracked. The phone activity stopped. Her social media became carefully curated, and within days, Emily Carter ceased to exist in the open world. She was now someone else, living under the shadow of a powerful man. At first, Emily's new life seemed like the dream she had always wanted. Photos recovered from her private accounts showed her draped in designer gowns, seated in luxury cars with golden interiors, and walking through hotels that gleamed with marble and crystal. Gifts arrived daily: diamond bracelets, silk handbags, perfumes from Paris. To outsiders, it looked like she had stepped into a fantasy, but behind the polished images, reality was far more complicated. Investigators later pieced together what her days were like through testimonies from those who had once worked in the Sheikh's household. Emily was not a wife in the traditional sense, nor even a guest. She was more of a possession, someone brought into a gilded cage. Her movements were heavily restricted. Staff members watched her closely, recording her routines, reporting back on her behavior. Even her phone use was limited, with certain apps and calls carefully monitored. At first, Emily tried to embrace the illusion. She posed for pictures, smiled for the camera, and convinced herself this was better than the quiet suburban life she had left behind. But slowly, the cracks began to show. She realized she could not step outside without permission, could not contact her family freely, and could not make decisions for herself. Every choice, from what she wore to where she sat, belonged to someone else. Sources claimed she began to feel isolated and restless. The glittering gifts lost their shine, and the palace walls started to feel suffocating. Though she had run from her ordinary life, she now found herself trapped in one where wealth could not disguise control. It became clear that Emily's new chapter was not a fairy tale. It was a prison wrapped in silk and gold, and she was already struggling to breathe inside it. Back in Texas, Emily's family clung to hope that she would eventually call, even just to say she was safe. Her mother checked the phone constantly, while Daniel spent nights refreshing her social media, desperate for any sign she was still alive. For a brief period, updates trickled in, images of beaches, expensive dinners, and luxury cars. They carried captions that sounded rehearsed, as though written for an audience rather than family. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The accounts went silent, leaving only unanswered questions. Investigators traced her last online activity to a private villa located on the outskirts of Dubai. Records showed her phone pinged from inside the compound one evening before going dark completely. After that, there was no trace of calls, messages, or internet use. It was as if she had been cut off from the world overnight. Those who once saw her at events noticed her absence. Guests recalled that she seemed quieter in her final appearances, her smile forced, her eyes distant. Some remembered she often lingered near doors or windows, as if calculating an escape. But after her sudden disappearance from the social scene, whispers started spreading that she had been sent away or hidden. Her family reached out to international authorities, desperate for answers, but cooperation was limited. The foreign villa was private property, and access to it was tightly controlled. No one could confirm if Emily was still alive inside those walls. For Daniel, each passing day without a word felt heavier. The silence was more painful than any truth, because it left space for fear and imagination. Somewhere across the ocean, Emily's voice had been silenced, and no one knew if she was being kept alive or if she was already gone. The weeks following Emily's last trace stretched into a month of unbearable uncertainty. For a family in Texas, each sunrise carried fresh dread, and every night ended in disappointment. The missing posters had faded on telephone poles, and public interest began to shift toward other stories. But for those closest to her, the silence was suffocating. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth. Daniel lived under constant suspicion, even though investigators had found nothing to tie him to her disappearance. Neighbors avoided him. Whispers followed him to the grocery store, and his workplace grew uneasy with the media attention. He carried himself like a man half-broken, sleeping in his truck to escape the empty house that had once held both laughter and arguments. His innocence no longer mattered to the public. The mystery around Emily made him an easy villain in their minds. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, investigators were running into walls. International communication proved slow, and requests for access to properties in Dubai were either denied or ignored. Without cooperation, they could not confirm what had happened to Emily. Some officials quietly admitted they feared she had met a violent end, but without proof, the case remained a cruel limbo. Rumors swirled in both countries. Some claimed Emily had angered the sheik with demands for freedom. Others suggested she was sold off to another wealthy man, her identity hidden forever. A darker theory was that she had been silenced permanently, her disappearance covered by powerful hands that no one dared challenge. For her family, hope clashed with dread. The lack of answers was its own form of torture. Each day of that month stretched endlessly until the silence broke, not with Emily's voice, but with a discovery that confirmed their worst fears. The silence finally shattered when fishermen along the Persian Gulf pulled something unusual from the water. At first, they thought it was just another container washed in from the sea, but as they pried it open, the reality was horrifying. Inside the sealed plastic bin were human remains, carefully wrapped and weighted with stones. What they had found was not a full body, only the lower half of a young woman, cut with chilling precision. The discovery spread quickly, drawing in authorities who immediately suspected foul play of the highest order. Forensic teams worked swiftly, transporting the remains to a secure facility. Tests confirmed what many feared. The body belonged to Emily Carter. The DNA matched, and identifying marks on her skin removed any doubt. But the grim detail was that only half of her had been found. The rest of her body, along with answers to how she died, remained missing. The method of dismemberment was clean, almost surgical, suggesting someone with knowledge or access to professional tools. It was not the work of chance, nor of panic, but of planning. The news hit Texas like a storm. Emily's family broke down as the confirmation arrived, and Daniel, who had held on to even the faintest hope, collapsed under the weight of the truth. What had begun as a missing person case had now turned into a murder investigation, one that stretched across continents. Authorities questioned why only part of her was disposed of and why it was placed where it could eventually be found. Some believed it was meant as a warning. Others thought it was a mistake in an otherwise controlled operation. But one fact was undeniable. Emily's life had ended in brutal violence, and her killers had gone to great lengths to make sure the full truth stayed hidden. The discovery of Emily's remains only deepened the mystery, and attention quickly shifted toward those who had surrounded her in Dubai. The sheik, whose wealth and influence had drawn her across the ocean, was questioned by local authorities but denied any involvement. Through his lawyers, he claimed that Emily had left his villa weeks earlier and that he had no knowledge of what happened afterward. His statement was polished, rehearsed, and carefully released to the media. Yet investigators knew his household staff told a different story, one they would soon struggle to keep hidden. Several workers admitted privately that Emily had not left the villa as claimed. They remembered seeing her confined to her room, guarded and withdrawn, days before she disappeared completely. Some described arguments overheard at night, her voice trembling against louder, angrier tones. But when investigators returned to re-interview these witnesses, many had vanished. Some were deported suddenly, others resigned and disappeared without trace. The timing was too convenient, suggesting that someone powerful had ensured their silence. Theories began to grow. Perhaps Emily had demanded freedom and met violent resistance. Perhaps jealousy played a role, as the sheik was rumored to keep multiple women hidden in separate residences. Another possibility was darker still, that her death had been orchestrated not as an accident or outburst, but as a calculated decision to prevent scandal. Despite mounting suspicions, the sheik remained untouchable. His wealth, connections, and influence created walls investigators could not penetrate. Every lead seemed to dissolve into shadows, every potential witness silenced or unreachable. What was left were fragments of truth that pointed in his direction but stopped short of proof. The more authorities searched for answers, the clearer it became that the truth about Emily's final days was being buried under power, privilege, and fear. Emily's partial remains were flown back to Texas, where her family held a funeral that felt both incomplete and unbearable. The casket was small, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions, and mourners whispered about the cruelty of burying only half of her body. What should have been closure only reopened wounds, because the truth about her death remained hidden. The young woman who once dreamed of escape and glamour had instead become a victim of shadows, and her story ended in fragments. Daniel stood apart from the crowd, hollow-eyed and aged beyond his years. Though cleared of suspicion, he lived under a cloud of judgment. To many, he was still the man who had been abandoned, the husband who had failed to see what his wife truly wanted, or worse, the man who had driven her into danger. He carried that weight silently, retreating further into himself as the world dissected Emily's choices and her fate. Meanwhile, the sheik's life continued untouched. Behind fortified walls and legal defenses, he remained out of reach, his name never formally tied to the murder. In the eyes of the law, there was no case strong enough to stand against him. The unanswered questions, why only half her body was found, who carried out the dismemberment, and what role power played in silencing her story, were left to speculation. Emily's tragedy became a cautionary tale whispered in documentaries and news specials. The story of a woman lured by the promise of luxury, only to be trapped in a cage from which she would never escape. To her family, she was not a headline but a daughter, a sister, and a wife whose absence would never fade. Justice was never served, and the mystery of her final moments remained sealed in silence, lost forever to the tides of power and fear.